Welcome to The Fine Print, the podcast where we explore the law, its impact, and the people who shape it. I'm your host, Riddell, and on today's episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Ms.Rebecca Vathanasin, Associate Director at a Singaporean law firm with a specialization in family law. Having practiced at all levels of the Singapore courts, as well as frequently engaging in pro bono work, Ms. Vathanasin brings both expertise and care to her work. She is a leading lawyer in the field of family law, known for her patience, empathy, and ability to guide her clients through some of life's toughest moments with confidence. So, to start us off, what drew you into specializing in family law, and what are the various cases that fall under it?
Well, so I'll just start by saying hi and thank you for having me on your show. How or why I got into family law? I always thought it was a very interesting area of practice. It's an area of practice that you see on television quite often. So I suppose that could have given me a jumpstart in terms of my interest. But on a very personal note, my parents also went through a divorce when I was 12. So, going through that process with them and seeing how they went through that process really opened my eyes into the area of family law. And I would say that was a very big part of why I got into it. I think as a child of a divorcing couple, you do feel a lot of the effects, even when your parents try very hard not to involve you in it. And I remember one of the things that I felt at the time was very, very helpless. And so I think I wanted to be a voice for children as far as possible, because having been there, I know what it's like. I know what's going through their minds. And yeah, I wanted very much to advocate for them and be a voice for them in divorce proceedings.
Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience with family law and having that motivation come through you through your own personal experience is very insightful and inspiring. So beyond the kind of cases that you handle, I'm curious, family law must come with its own unique challenges. So what are some ethical dilemmas that you often see arising in this area?
Family law, it's very emotional sometimes. And as you pointed out, there are ethical dilemmas that do pop up from time to time. I think one of the very big ones, very common ones that we do see are cases of adultery, in which case one party has cheated on their spouse. And I've represented wives who had philandering husbands, but I've also represented husbands or even wives who have been the ones who have committed adultery against the other party. And I guess sometimes I find myself sitting down and asking myself whether or not I am representing the right party. And that was something that I struggled with very early on in practice. But then after a while, I realized that it's really not my place to pass any judgment or, I suppose, view them any lesser because of the choices that they have made. I remind myself that we are all human and we make mistakes. And my job really is to help them put an end to this chapter and help them transition into the next one. It was very, very trying in the early years. I remember one of these cases I handled, I represented a husband who was cheating by the wife. And I remember in court, the wife actually yelled at me. And she said, "I can't believe you're acting for him. You're a woman yourself. How could you do this?" And it didn't feel good, obviously. It really, really didn't feel good. And of course, I was thinking to myself, why are you yelling at me? Your anger is clearly very misguided, But it wouldn't have made sense for me to call her out on that at that point in time, because I don't think she would have understood or taken to it very well. But it definitely left an impression. And I remember going home that day feeling really, really awful. Didn't feel good. Asked myself if I was doing the right thing, if I was representing the right people. But again, then that's when I took myself back and say, look, it's a job at the end of the day. I'm just here to not judge. I'm here to help them transition to the next phase of their lives. And so for me, that's really how I deal with these ethical dilemmas. And happy to say that I can sleep quite well at night. Not feeling guilty anymore, which is good.
Yeah. Those kinds of dilemmas sound incredibly complex, especially with cheating and adultery kind of cases. There's always two sides to the story.
Correct.
And I think as a lawyer, it's so important to acknowledge both sides.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge both sides, but it's also very important not to judge. I think it's a very human nature thing to pass judgment on someone. But I've also realized over the years that cheating, it's very rarely a very spontaneous thing. A lot of times I think what parties fail to realize is that something had already gone wrong in the relationship, right? It could be a case of one party feeling very lonely at home because the other party is never home, or they have very different views in life, different personalities, such that they just stop communicating with one another, or they find it very difficult to communicate with one another. And then they end up seeking solace in another person, for example. But I think for any spouse who is on that end of being cheated on, it's a very hard thing to, acknowledge and accept that, oh, okay, I have also contributed to this. Because it's very hard to see that when you're feeling hurt.
As a lawyer, especially, that really brings insight into how sometimes a lawyer can see the two different sides of the story quite clearly. Whereas if you're actually in that situation, this understanding might not come in the moment, or it might actually never come to you that, oh, it was actually my fault, or it was actually their fault, and I contributed to this. So kind of touching on what you mentioned earlier about emotions and just handling the different kinds of outbursts that may happen, how do you balance supporting clients through their emotions while still focusing on the legal and practical aspects of their case?
This is quite a hard one because I'm not ashamed to say that it's something that I still struggle with even till now, despite doing this for almost 10 years. I think I always try and draw boundaries with my clients. I want to make it very clear to them that I support you in any way possible. I don't judge you. And I want this to be a safe space for you. But I also tell myself that whatever happens during the proceedings, whatever that is being, said between parties, it's not something that I'm going to take home with me. Because I think the minute I start to do that, it just follows me home. It keeps me up at night. And then when I get emotionally affected by these things, then it starts clouding my judgment. And I feel that I'm not able to perform my duties or my role in the way that I'm supposed to. So I think a lot of it really is compartmentalizing and having enough emotions to be able to empathize with the client and be there for them, but drawing the line and not going overboard with those emotions because, as I said just now, if I become too emotional about it, then it clouds my judgment and I'm not able to represent them effectively.
Yeah, I can imagine that's hard. Because each individual is so emotionally different and we're emotional creatures. Humans are emotional creatures.
Yeah.
So having that emotional boundary is quite difficult to establish because for your boundary, it might be something for one client, but it might mean something to another client.
Yeah.
So it just varies. And I think that's just something that comes in part and parcel with the job.
It is. There was something, a late lawyer, he passed away, I think maybe 1-2 years ago. But he said something very poignant. I still remember it to this day. He goes, family lawyers are emotional laborers. Because we carry, I hate the word burden because it's really not a burden. It just comes part and parcel of your job to hear these things from your clients, right? But I realized that it's true. You do take on a lot of these emotions. You carry it with you and it does burden you to some extent because it, as I said just now, it's sometimes you can't help but take it home with you and then it festers in your mind and it keeps you up at night. But that's where I mentioned earlier, it's very important to compartmentalize and then just not bring it home.
Yeah. And it's kind of clear that family law isn't just between the two parties. It actually affects more than that. It might affect the lawyer themselves, such as in your case, having the emotional boundary, or it might also affect children in this situation. So how have you kind of seen children being affected by family law, as sometimes they might be at the heart of a dispute or the heart of a conflict? And what role do they play in custodial cases?
So unfortunately, I would say that they are very often at the heart of a lot of divorce disputes. It's very unfortunate. I hate that it happens, but I also understand why it happens. When things are falling apart, I think us as individuals try very hard to cling on to what we have. It's, I suppose, to some extent, it's self-preservation, right? You're trying to retain control over your lives, and I think a lot of it also is retaining control over the children. And I think, unfortunately, in a lot of divorce cases, you see children being used as a pawn where, a party behaves in a certain way or does something to gain an advantage over the other, insofar as having custody of the child is concerned. And it's really a shame. It really, really is. In terms of the effects, I've seen children go into depression because of what's going on between their families. And again, as I shared with you just now, having gone through that myself, I think as a kid, because we don't have the ability to process what we're thinking or feeling. And I think also as Asians, it's not in our nature to communicate or to express what we're feeling. And so perhaps from a very personal insight, I remembered thinking to myself, is this my fault? Did I cause this divorce? Oh, I threw a little temper tantrum today and my parents started fighting after that. It must have been my fault that this was a divorce. It's obviously not going to be the case for every child and every divorce that I handle, but I can only imagine that this is just one of the many things that is running through the minds of children of divorce. So I do really feel for them in that regard. I think little things I've done is, for example, telling the parents, do communicate with your children. Don't ever feel, I think it's a very Asian thing to say, this is adult business, don't get involved in this. But children are very aware, right? They're very receptive, but they're also very resilient. I think that's something that parents very often forget. And I think it's so important for the children to be aware of what's happening and also be assured that everything is going to be okay. I think a lot of times there is that fear on the part of the child, oh my gosh, once this divorce goes through, am I going to be abandoned? Am I going to go to mommy? Am I going to go to daddy? There's a lot of that going through their minds. That was certainly what was going through my mind. So I think if a parent makes the effort to sit down with the children and say, this is what's going to happen, but sweetheart, everything is going to be okay. Nothing's going to change. Mommy and daddy are still going to be very much involved in your lives. We're just going to start living in two separate households, but hey, you get two homes now, little things like that, I think really do go a long way in ensuring the child that nothing's going to change, right? And even if there are changes, which is inevitable, it is something that you will get through together as a family, right? So I do always try and push my clients to do that as far as possible. And I think I've also had clients where children, I think it's normal for us to try and put the blame on someone. And so I have been on the receiving end of a child saying, this is all your fault, it's the lawyer's fault. And of course, they say this is a very emotional response without understanding the circumstances, right? And I've said to clients before, I'm actually very okay if you want your kid to come down to the office. I'm very happy to explain what's going on. Obviously, it will be good for you to obtain the consent of the other parent, of course, because he or she may not like it. But it is something that I've offered before so that they understand what's actually happening. And I told them, you can ask any questions that you would like, right? I will try and answer them as much as possible so that you can understand that's, what you're hearing or what you think is happening isn't actually happening, and yeah, I'd like to think that these little things do help them in the process.
Yeah, I'm really sure it does, because at the end of the day, I think the child just wants to feel safe and they just want to feel valued in the environment that they're in the way that, it's not my fault.
Yes.
Like all of this wasn't because of me and because of my actions, which I think is something children might face because they need the reassurance from parents and from other people at that time.
Correct.
Because it's something that they're struggling with.
Correct. And I think it also, just to add to that, I think it also helps for them to hear it from a third party.
Yeah.
Not just mom or dad, because I think sometimes, especially in a very, very ugly divorce, we do see one parent bad-mouthing the other and vice versa. And I think the child also gets very confused. Is what mommy's saying is true? Is what daddy's saying is true? But then to have a third party say, hey, why don't you come and meet with me and I'll answer any questions that you have, I think gives them a very objective view in terms of what's happening. And as you said, assures them that, everything's going to be okay and you're not going to be neglected. And
yeah, I think just allowing them to make their own perception or perspective on the case is quite important, as they might just be forced into thinking one kind of way because, I'm spending more time with this parent. So if this parent says something like that, then maybe I should just agree with it.
Yeah.
So it kind of shows and really brings insight into how children's experiences can be deeply shaped by these proceedings.
Absolutely.
And, maybe kind of mental health cases that arise with these kinds of cases as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that brings up another important angle. So the matter of privacy, especially within the family. So are there any issues with this kind of privacy that you need to be aware of while understanding or presenting the case? And how do you handle that?
This is a very tough one. So Within law, and this is not unique to family law, there is a concept of privilege where whatever that is said between client and lawyer is privileged. I can't actually disclose that to someone else, for example.
Mhm.
So there is the element of it, and clients can be assured in that regard that whatever that is being said between lawyer and client is going to be kept between lawyer and client unless I am authorized to disclose that to the other party or to the court. But I think sometimes what becomes very, very tricky is that you have a client saying, I don't necessarily want our parents to know what's happening or my kid to know what's happening. How do we get around that? What do I say to them when they ask why I've moved out of the house, for example? And it's very interesting to me because these are actually not legal questions, right? And so I always tell them that this is not a legal question, but I can only suggest this or I can only suggest that. But yeah, that's always a very, very tricky thing to maneuver. But yeah.
Yeah. I think having that, again, coming back to emotional balance and, having that emotions kind of in check. I think sometimes in these situations, people might just be looking for a way for their emotional output rather than having more of a practical understanding.
Yeah.
They just need someone to talk to, maybe.
That's exactly what it is. We always joke among ourselves, my colleagues and I, that we end up playing the role of counselor for the most part because we don't really have an avenue to talk about these things, right?
Yeah.
But again, it can be so tricky because there's just certain things that happens and they just don't want to talk about it or they don't want to disclose that to the other party. And then I also then have a very difficult task because I end up telling the client, I can't really advance your case if I can't disclose this, right? And then there were also times where I say, I have to disclose this. I'm an officer of the court. I am legally obliged to disclose this. And then so we have that issue of how do we manage this? Because whatever I say, when it comes out, is going to have a very big, they're going to be ramifications for or repercussions for it, and how are we going to deal with that, right? So yeah, it's just something that has to be very delicately managed, and we always try our hardest to work with the client to make sure that these things are being managed, because I think divorce it's a very, very painful thing to go through. I mean, court process aside, it's a very emotional thing. Right. So you're trying to deal with the court process. You're trying to figure out what's going to happen next in your life. You're trying to figure out how to deal with your children, how to break the news to them. You're trying to figure out how to manage living with your other half while all of this is going on. Right. It's not a very, very easy thing to do. But as I said, we can help them through it and manage it as far as possible.
Yeah. And your role as a lawyer really stands out through all this because that kind of shows how you take on multiple facets of your job, not just, a lawyer, I'm here to help you sign paperwork, I'm here to help you do this, but just being there for your client in its own has its own value.
Yes.
So moving on, what are some common myths about family law and being a family lawyer?
Common myths in family law. I think the most common is because we have women's charter here in Singapore that regulates, or rather it's the statute that we rely on for family proceedings. There's a very common misconception that because it's termed women's charter, that it would be more favorable to the women. Perhaps in the past, I would say to some extent, there is some preference in the sense that women are entitled to maintenance from their husbands, for example, but men are not entitled to maintenance from their wives, right? So I can understand why that perception came up. But I always find myself having to tell clients, especially my male clients, no, don't worry. Just because it's called women's charter doesn't mean that you're going to lose this case. It just doesn't happen that way, right? I think there's another very, very common myth that if one party has cheated, then the other party is entitled to everything. And so again, I have to tell them that's actually not the case. And so often they would say, what? But it's the women's charter. What do you mean I don't get everything? But he cheated. I don't understand. This is so unfair. And I have to say, I'm very sorry. I understand what you're going through. I understand the hurt that you're feeling, but it doesn't necessarily entitle you to everything that he's worth. So yeah, I hope that makes it very clear for everyone listening this that does not happen. Women's charter doesn't necessarily favor the women just because it has women in the title, and you're not necessarily entitled to everything that your husband has just because he has committed adultery.
Yeah, that's definitely a myth debunked. From the name itself, Women's Charter, I think a lot of people might just assume many things about that, but clearly it's not the case.
No, it's not like this. Perhaps we have to rename it, I don't know, Family Charter or just something else so that there isn't that misconception.
Yeah. So kind of coming back to your role as a lawyer and just understanding all these different parts of knowledge that make up your job as a whole, what are some of the most common issues people come to you with in family law? And what is one thing couples and families should know before filing for a family law or matrimonial case?
I think very common if a client is coming to me for advice on a divorce specifically, very common questions, first and foremost, would always be what's going to happen to my children, which I think is an absolutely valid question to ask, right? Because everything is so uncertain, everything is up in the air at that point that you just want to know or have some certainty in terms of, what the family is going to look like post-divorce. So yes, childcare arrangements, first and foremost, is something that always comes up. And then, of course, there'll be the issue of maintenance or alimony in the sense of, what am I entitled to? Is he going to be paying me anything? Is she going to be paying me anything? Are my kids going to be provided for? And then, of course, the other common question would then be, okay, we have a house, we have this, we have that. How much am I going to get out of it? Right? So very, very common questions. And again, very valid questions. If you kind of take a step back, it's not so much that they want to know specifically about these things. I think what most clients actually just want to have is certainty, right? Certainty and assurance in knowing that while there's going to be a lot of changes in their lives, not everything will change. And I think that's where a lot of these questions stem from.
Yeah. And, having these kinds of questions come up is quite beneficial to the person itself because they might come into this unaware of everything.
Absolutely. So that's why I do like clients. Some of them come in and they say, look, I've not quite decided yet. I still want to give my husband a second chance, for example, but I just want to know what a divorce process is going to look like. I want to know what I need to prepare ahead of time. And I do like clients like that because it tells me that ultimately when they do make a decision to proceed for divorce, it's one that they have thought through very carefully, right? It's one that they are prepared for as they go into it, as opposed to an individual who makes that decision, in a spur of the moment.
Yeah, I think just having that understanding of, having made a decision in haste or rather having a lot of time to think about it really affects the outcome of the case as a whole. And more than anything, just affects the emotion regulation.
Absolutely. I think a lot of times when individuals make very rash decisions, they are often very emotional responses. And so, as the word would suggest, they're still very much emotional about what's happening. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But my concern when you have individuals acting on emotions is that they're not necessarily rational, right? Or they are reacting out of anger or out of hurt, as opposed to taking a step back and being rational in the decisions that they make. I would say that if you have a couple that does not have any children, that would not be the worst thing in the world. But when you have children in the mix and you're making very, very rash decisions, which arise out of emotions, then of course my concern is how is this going to affect the children? And that's something that I really do hope that couples contemplating divorce do think about, right? Because I think a lot of times, when there's anger and hurt involved, we're not the best versions of ourselves and we're not making the best decisions. But at the same time, these decisions that we make, we don't necessarily realize that it affects other people around us, especially children who may not have the ability to understand or process what is going on, right? So it's important for us adults to be adults and make decisions, good decisions, with the children in mind, as opposed to it just being a very emotional response to something.
Yeah, so talking about the outcome and the effects of all these kinds of various situations, I'd like to ask you what are some of the most rewarding outcomes and what's the most rewarding part of working in this field?
It's always very nice to see parties move on from this chapter and create new chapters for themselves. I've had the benefit of seeing clients, the kids grow up, and I get updates from them and say, my child is in this school now and it would not have been possible if not for you. And I always say that's not true because they would have done it, on their own with or without me. But it's nice to see that progression. It's nice to see them find peace. Just very recently, I had a meeting between parties and I'm still very emotional thinking about it, to be honest with you, because it was fairly recent and I haven't had the time to process it. But one of the issues that came up was the fact that the wife felt quite unappreciated by the husband. And so I recall telling the husband, at the end of this meeting, if you can find it in yourself, and this is not legal advice, this is just something that I think could help the situation. But when was the last time you said thank you? She's already expressed feelings of being underappreciated. And so maybe we can just find a way to say thank you. And he said, let me think about it.
Mm.
And I was very surprised because at the end of the session, he actually did say thank you. And it was such a simple gesture of gratitude and appreciation. But I saw the wife in that moment she was getting very teary in the eye. And I saw her just soften up just by hearing the words thank you. And I thought what was very amazing about that was that when she heard him say it, she then took it upon herself to then also say, you know what, thank you as well. And as I said, I still get very emotional thinking about it because it's very nice to see them, start off as it was a very contentious divorce. They were fighting over everything. And then to see them follow through with them on the process. And then at the end of it conclude in such a amicable fashion, that is very satisfying to me. It's nice to be able to be a part of that and witness that.
Yeah. I think that's such a brilliant explanation on what keeps you motivated in such a demanding field.
Yeah.
Just having your clients be grateful at the end of the day for the outcome that they've achieved.
Yeah.
And just having them say a simple thank you, not only to their partner, not only to the whole process, but to you, but for getting them through this difficult situation of their life.
Yeah.
So thinking about the next generation and some future lawyers, what are some pieces of advice that you would like to give to young lawyers wanting to enter the field of family law?
You have to keep your emotions in check. I think that was something I touched very early on in this podcast. Compartmentalizing is something that is very, very important because, as I said, it's a balancing act, right? You need to have enough emotions to be able to empathize with the client, but not be overly emotional to the point where it clouds your judgment. So that's very, very important. And it's not an easy thing to do. The other thing I would say actually, and I have no shame in saying this, therapy. I think therapy is something that I absolutely push for. I think that it's a very taboo thing, I think, within the Asian culture. There's a very common misconception that if you're going to therapy, there must be something wrong with you. I don't think it is. I think if you're able to have a safe space to talk about certain things that you're going through as part of practice, it's actually a very good avenue for you. I've been doing it for about 2 years now, and I think it's such a healthy outlet for me to be able to talk through these things because sometimes it does, as much as I said just now, I shouldn't let these things burden me, but it does sometimes. It's inevitable, right? But it's good for me and any other lawyer to have that outlet where we're able to talk about these things candidly and not also be concerned about breaching privilege in any. Of course, I don't ever tell my therapist exactly what's going on, but I am still able to, say, oh, I've felt a certain way about a case and it was very, very hard for me, and then be able to process what I was feeling at that point in time. I've been in situations where I've acted for clients and I said, actually, why am I feeling a certain way? I recall a very specific incident where a client was telling me something over a meeting and there was this feeling just nagging away at me and I didn't quite understand it. And then when the client eventually left, I went to the bathroom and it was the strangest thing. I just started crying and I just didn't understand why I was crying or what I was crying about. And then it was only through that process of therapy and just talking about it, it became known to me that it was something that I'd actually experienced myself very early on in my life. And so what I was feeling at that point in time was very repressed memories, having gone through that. But I would not have been able to put two and two together had it not been for that therapy process. So it is something I absolutely recommend as far as possible. And come in with an open mind. That's all I can say. Come in with an open mind. Because you will hear all sorts of things. And as I said, it's so hard not to judge. But you have to realize that, everyone is human. Yeah.
Of course. That's amazing and really eye-opening advice. Just something as going to therapy. We keep talking about that emotional output for your clients or for the children, but where's the emotional output for the lawyer? That's where therapy kind of comes in and all the strings kind of attach to make this whole system function. So hopefully by you speaking about this, it makes it a little more less taboo. I kind of know what you're talking about in this sense, especially being in an Asian community. This is a bit more on the taboo side, unfortunately. And I really hope that this really reaches someone who can experience what you're talking about and actually goes to therapy as well.
Yes. And maybe just to help, someone told me this many years ago when I was still contemplating whether to do it. And she says, look, some women buy handbags and some women do spa treatments and you do therapy. But at the end of the day, all these things do, to some extent, I suppose, bring you some peace and happiness, right? So this is the way forward for you.
Yeah.
So if that analogy helps, it really did help me. I thought to myself, that actually really makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Not as to handbags and not to spa, but maybe this is something that I can do for myself. And that made it easier for me to say, okay, I don't mind giving this a try. And it's been a blessing since then. So.
Yeah, like a form of self-care.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, yeah, that brings us to the end of our episode. So thank you so much for your time, Ms. Vathanasin, and sharing your personal experiences with us. And to all my listeners, court is now adjourned. Until next time with The Fine Print.